Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Lacy Brooks Pack, Bad Moon Rising, Part 2, by Michael Lockhart. Earl Wolf was stunned when he saw the figure that burst through the doorway to his paddock. He caught a whiff of her to confirm her identity. It was the female, the one who gave him pleasant dreams, the one whose blood stirred his own and whose scent caused his stomach to gnaw on itself. He rose weakly, having to use his arms to push himself from the bed. He climbed shakily to his feet and growled menacingly at the figure before him. He tried to loom over her, but found that he was no more than half a foot taller than she was. What happened to my towering physique? He wondered. The female two-legs stared at him in obvious alarm. Her fierce stench made his mouth water. Or is it just drool? He again wondered at his own weakness. His legs began to literally tremble with effort. Though whether the effort was to restrain himself or remain upright, he was unsure. He wanted desperately to chomp and rend this one. She was the target for his hunger-lust, yet he struggled with the concept. He loved this one. He didn't want to harm her. He couldn't devour someone he cared for, yet he felt he must, or he would perish from starvation. His internal struggle mounted, and then she spoke. "Earl, it's me, Val. Do you recognize me? Look, I don't want to rush you, but if you can still walk, we have to get out of this place. I found Adele down the corridor. Her cell is right by a set of stairs that lead upward. I'm not sure if it's an exit, but we have to try. Do you understand?" Earl grew instantly angry at the mention of Adele. He wanted desperately to save his granddaughter. He promised her and her mother. The anger gave him some energy and resolve. He stiffened both his legs to steady himself. He determined to answer the two-legged woman, this Val, unthinkingly, and for the first time in uncounted months, he spoke using a human word. His muzzle had reduced to the point where he could answer, "Yes." Val gestured for him to come along. She didn't quite dare touch him, and she was terribly concerned at his appearance. Yet it was definitely Uncle Earl, her Earl. She led and he followed. They made their way to Adele's enclosure and saw that she still sat, still stared and drooled, eyes and expression vacant. Val worked her magic on the door while Earl examined the bodies piled on the stairwell. One pair of eyes glared up at him with understanding. The others wore expressions like Adele's. He knew those eyes. He hated those eyes. He wanted to rend them from the ugly fat face and bite into the neck. "Earl, come help me with her," Valerie called, and the spell broke. He sent one last baleful look towards the keeper, and then turned to seek his granddaughter. "Adele," he growled when he saw the young dog-woman. He tried to awaken her with his tone, but she only stared for a moment and then raised her head. She looked towards him expectantly, but otherwise she did not acknowledge his address. "Come on, sweet one, we must go find our pack." She rose and waited for him to step back and then followed. He turned to Val. "Lead the way. We're both weak, and we'll have to help one another, but we'll keep up." He was startled at the alacrity with which he regained his ability to speak the two-legs language. He'd had more struggles to speak to Adele in the language of the long snouts and large teeth. They followed Val out of the stairway and started to climb. He had to coax Adele and give her specific instructions to continue to follow him. He did not know what was wrong. They would have to learn more after they made good their escape. His ears were still sharp, and he heard the noises coming from the corridor below. Even as they cleared the first landing, he confirmed with a quick sniff, "Val, people coming." he warned. She looked down and nodded. There wasn't anything to do but continue as quietly as possible. She couldn't rush her cryptid companions in their condition, and she wasn't sure where they were going anyway. She regretted not slitting the keeper's throat. Once, whoever it was that headed down the corridor found that one, he'd tell on the escapees. No use crying over unspilled blood, she remonstrated herself. Dr. Z had decided that while he awaited the results of his latest experiment, he would take a tour of his facility and see whether his manager was doing his duties. He liked to see for himself, especially after the female Sasquatch's escape. The Z-Techs had assignments or rested in their dorm. He wasn't sure that they slept the way normal humans did. He was reasonably sure that their minds were in constant sleep-dream mode. Narcissa had hinted at that, something just shy of a lucid dreaming state. Later, when he had time, he would conduct a study on the effects of zombification. The Z-Squad guards were in place, mainly as a response device in case something went wrong. Most doubled as hunters, and Charlie and Dawn had several out to help them check traps. Those two, especially Charlie, had done a good job, verging on the great. In the beginning, there had been 2 other professional hunters, but the cryptids tended to take a toll. He pondered his specimens. Only a few were of local origin. Most had been created here from the natural venom of the originals. They had started as local yokels and their pets. He was sure that his was not the only research facility for the operators, but each one had a different purpose. He had created the side project for his own in the vivification serum, and wondered if there were multiple functional facilities. Others likely worked on something similar, methods to gain the strengths of cryptid monsters without having to suffer the defects of form and mind that accompanied their transformation. For those that did so, or their nature for those that simply were, he began his inspection of the paddocks and worked his way down the long, twisting corridor that turned back on itself so many times. He'd never counted how many. It had never mattered. Perhaps he would set a Z-Tech to the task the next slow day. He made it nearly to the end. He was particularly anxious to see the 3 new specimens, though he'd had the keeper remove the human girl up to a regular locked room in the upper part of the plant near the labs. He was concerned over the old werewolf. It had lost some mass along with its hair. Its ears had shrunken, as had its muzzle. They would have to tempt or goad it into eating. He would requisition a child from the traffickers. He reached the enclosure and saw that the door was open. The werewolf was not inside. The paddock stank and was in need of cleaning. Perhaps the keeper had moved the creature into the one that had held the girl. Her smell might induce the creature to hunger. She was quite fetching. His concerns were not raised until he reached her cell and found her gone as well. He took out his personal device and rang the keeper. There was no response at first. Then, just as he was about to send another ring, a raspy voice. "Yes." It sounded enough like the keeper that the doctor heard what he'd expected to hear. "Where are the old wolf and the young girl? They are not in their cells. I wish to inspect them. Where have you placed them?" There was another long pause. Perhaps the keeper was busy with something, or in the restroom, he decided. "Girls upstairs. Wolf's down the hall." The deeper than usual voice rasped. Dr. Z considered for a moment. Down the hall? He knew that there were no more empty paddocks between here and the final few. Were there? Perhaps the keeper had gone back to playing his old games and fed the old werewolf to a different monster. Maybe it had succumbed and he was too afraid to alert the good doctor. That was even more likely. Meet me at the final paddock with the young female dogman.
I'll be there,
the device speaker rasped. Val shook her head. That was close. How long have you been able to speak human, Earl? Your mouth looks much less like a snout, but your teeth are still too big. At least you're canines. Earl didn't feel like chatting. He was incredibly tired, yet he knew that he needed the distraction to keep him from thoughts of drinking the lovely-smelling plasma that coursed so hotly inside his companion.
Since you first spoke to me, didn't know I changed that much. Haven't been eating. I was afraid since you first spoke to me, didn't know I'd changed that much. Haven't been eating. I was afraid they were going to give me an IV, or worse yet, put in a small child that would squall and send my instincts into overdrive.
It was a long speech for him, and it made his mouth tired, trying to form the words. We've reached the top, Val informed him. Adele still stared mindlessly. She tried the key card, and it gave an indicator light for her to punch in the code. She used the one she had. It didn't work. She tried again, and the reader flashed a message that she'd only one try before security staff were notified. She tried again with the numbers reversed. The door clicked open, but just as Adele, who brought up the rear, cleared the threshold, she heard an alarm sound. It wasn't all that loud, but it was accompanied by flashing lights and a synthesized voice. Security alert, front entrance. Security alert, front entrance. The doorway had opened into a small landing that faced the lake. A set of stairs led down to the head of a dirt trail that led into the woods. The trio of escapees piled down the stairs and set off up the trail. They had to find transportation, or the hounds would be on them, Val realized. Then another thought intruded. The alarm had been for the front entrance. Surely this was not it. It had to be the one with the garage. Someone from the facility had clearly been in the corridor. Now someone else was knocking at their front door. Someone uninvited by the owners, but very welcome for her purpose. Lacy stepped through the garage door and stalked around for a moment to scout it out. She found the entrance to the main facility with no problem, but paused and listened and smelled before she signaled the rest of the pack to enter. The Sasquatch came in, Charlie slung uncomfortably under its arm. Oscar and Earl, too, padded into the garage and quickly did a secondary check. They met at the large door. Charlie waved. Hey, you gotta use the card and the code to get in that door. Can you read numbers? Lacy signaled to the old man of the forest, who dropped Charlie. Charlie grunted but climbed to his feet. He didn't need a second lesson in consequences. Dawn's severed head had been enough to cow him. He was after money, not glory. Even as he typed in the numbers, the alarm sounded. He looked up startled. He pointed to the camera nearest the door. Security spotted us. Time to fish or cut bait. He slowed back away from the door, but Oscar's chest ached as a backstop. The big dogman stepped around him and took hold of the door handle. He pulled with all his strength and weight, and the handle broke off in his hand. He stared at it in disgust and frustration for a moment, then tossed it aside. Then the door opened, and a Z-Squad guard stood and stared at the group with no comprehension of what he saw, just the impulse to follow his last instruction. Oscar gutted the creature, and it slumped to the floor. Still staring vacantly as it died, the pack surged forward and left Charlie on the doorstep. He employed the better part of valor and fled to the big truck. Naked or not, it was time to haul ass. His. Dr. Z heard the alarm and saw the flashing lights in the corridor like all the rest. He hurried back through the corridor to get up to his office. It was armored and protected against the assault and had an escape hatch should the need arise. He hadn't quite made it down to the end of the corridor, so Carlos and his Z-Tech attendants continued their uncomfortable and frustrated repose on the stairwell. The good doctor intended to stop at the control room and check the monitors. He had no idea who or what could have invaded the perimeter. Perhaps his human monitor could tell him, considering what he held in confinement. All the creatures and cryptids. It could be anybody. His primary hope was to get back in time to check on Blanchard. All else was secondary to that experiment. It could literally mean his life. Even now, the hammering in his chest from stress and exertion put a strain on his heart, and he knew that as fiercely as it seemed to pound, it was in fact very weak and in a bad state. He heard sounds from up the corridor, sounds of violence. He glanced around to determine where he was. He had made it back to the halfway point, but would make it no further if he was discovered. He quickly examined and evaluated the paddock around him. The one with the skunk ape. It had undergone his try at zombification. It sat now, staring into the middle distance. A rope of drool hung from the side of its mouth. He quickly scanned his card and entered the code for the enclosure. The beast did not move or give any indication that it understood the unfolding events, that the door, its escape route, was open and unguarded by any save an old, decrepit man. Dr. Z fished in his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He used it to block the door lock to keep it from engaging. It would click, but it was the only way to ensure that he had a means of egress. He hid himself behind the phony shrubbery, even as the invaders approached. "Come on, we'll get to the road. We can't go far, so we have to be smart. There was a Sasquatch who ran this direction. She must have been going somewhere." Val led the two struggling monsters down a game trail that split from the primary one. As they proceeded, they heard a roar of a large diesel engine as Charlie made tracks down the State Park Road towards the highway. She decided on a bold move and stepped out into the roadway. "Adele, when the truck stops, tear open the door and pull out the driver." If the truck stops, she thought internally. Charlie couldn't believe his eyes. The hot chick they'd grabbed a few days ago in the middle of the road, waving her arms frantically. "What's she doing outside?" he asked. Even as he brought the truck to a stop, he started to roll down the window, when from his periphery he caught the sight of a large shadow that all but flew towards him from the back end of the truck. Before he could react, the door ripped from his grasp and all but sprung from his hinges as it tore open. Hands with razor claws grasped him and pulled him close to the face of a dogman? No, it was the dog girl, one of the subjects on which Dr. Z had tried out the zombie venom. Her face and stare were blank like every zombo he'd seen. She still had nauseating breath, and it caused him to fight back his last meal. "Adele, hold him for a moment," Valerie spoke with authority and gentleness at once. "Hey, ma'am, you remember, I didn't do nothing to you the other day. I was just doing my job, you know?" Charlie's rolled his eyes towards Val. He couldn't move effectively since he was pressed against Adele's chest. Val grinned. It was not a grin that would inspire confidence in a supplicant. "Oh, I recall. You let your scumbag friend put his hands all over me. You did nothing but put me into a zoo to be experimented on by freaks." "Sure, you're a paragon of virtue. Hey, lady, I know you got a beef with me, but there's some of these monsters at the lab. They just broke in. They killed Dawn, so I was going out to get help." Val laughed without humor. "You have a radio or something like that in the truck? Why not use that to request assistance and then go back in with guns blazing?" Charlie simply looked at her with pleading eyes. He knew that there was nothing he could say to convince her to have mercy. "Maybe I could help you, give you a ride or something. He didn't get any further. A large hand cuffed him hard on the side of his head and neck. He fell silent when he lost consciousness, still clutched close to Adele. Val looked up at the infuriated face of Earl, less Earl Wolf by the hour, it seemed, his transformation in reverse. He stared into her eyes.
"I had to hit him. I was about to bite his head off. Not sure I could anymore, but I can imagine that human blood would do me any good. It might do plenty harm, though." "What?" he said. "Did he or his partner? Did they molest you?"
Valerie stared back, then hugged him. It was difficult for him. He still wanted to rend her to shreds and guzzle her blood, but it also felt incredibly good. She stepped back and laughed in earnest. "You think that with all you and Jean and Knox taught me, after all the funk jitsu classes, that turd like that would get to touch me inside my clothes? This one didn't try. I crunched his friend's doodahs for him and broke his nose besides. Worst thing any of them did was watch me use that hole in the floor that passed for a toilet." Earl fought down his murderous instincts, a fight that he won more easily than he had since his initial transformation. He grinned at her with something more akin to a human expression. "He said something about other dogmen. Had to be Lacy and Oscar." He glanced up at Adele in hopes that the names of her parents might awaken her. They did not. He spoke gently to her. "Adele, you are holding garbage. Throw away the filth." Adele wadded up the unfortunate Charlie, who began to regain his senses, just in time to feel his bones shatter. He screamed piteously, but received no sympathy. Adele looked around in confusion. She saw no trash receptacle, and Grandfather had always told her to use them. Earl saw the confusion and chuckled when he realized what caused it. He looked towards Val. "She's looking for a trash can or dumpster. I taught them how to clean up after themselves when around two legs." Lacy and company rushed down the corridor and looked through each glass. She sniffed the air desperately and listened for the cries of her daughter or father. At one door she paused for a moment. It smelled of a two-leg. An old male. The door lock was wedged open with a wallet. She removed it and tossed it on the floor, then closed the door and locked Dr. Z in with the skunk ape. Oscar and Earl, too, leapfrogged on ahead in the frantic search. At any moment she expected two legs with guns to start firing into the pack. The old man of the forest had bound ahead of him, all. He only had one target, and long legs to get him to her. The pack came upon the Sasquatch, beating on the door of the enclosure that contained his mate, his fury and hers from the other side. Despite their great size and strength, was not enough. Oscar attempted to help, but there was insufficient space. Lacy slammed into the window. The others soon joined her, and soon cracks appeared. The interior surface was polycarbonate. It would not shatter or break. She looked at the edges and began to slice at the lining of the window with her claws. It had started to work. Earl, too, had moved on down the hallway while they worked. He now came bounding back, an eager expression on his chops. "I found them. Adele and Grandfather, at least their scents. Their doors were open. Their scents were odd, but it was them. There was another. Aunt Val, your sister." Lacy and Oscar joined their son and urged him to go slowly and use caution in case security forces had responded. The Sasquatch and his mate would now be able to pull and push and beat the window aside. She noted each of the creatures in the paddocks and wanted to free them all, but they couldn't stay that long. They had already been inside for too long in her reckoning. She startled and stopped for a moment. Inside one of the paddocks loomed a figure that still gave her nightmares, a being of such ferocity that her hackles rose in fear, as much in anger. Je ne sais quoi. It was safe behind the glass, and she noted that it did not move. It did not rage about, as the others they'd encountered. It simply sat and stared, twitching occasionally, but otherwise still. They moved down and found the pile of human detritus at the foot of the stairs that led downward. The trail of her loved ones led upstairs, so that's the way they went. They cautiously approached the roadway, and when they saw the parked truck, they fanned out to set up a strike. Then Lacy saw her sister, Val. The young woman sat in the driver's seat of the truck. Before she could react, Val was torn from the cab and crushed into an embrace, much the way Charlie had been. Merde, his ghost had come back to get me, she thought in an absurd flash. Then she heard the huff, as the stench of dog-woman breath made her gag. Lacy. She was unable to exclaim aloud. Her sister had pressed the air from her lungs. Lacy set her down and looked around for Oscar and Earl, too. They emerged from the back of the truck. Each grinned in a way that confirmed that they had found their pack-mates. All of them, now that Val was with them. Val looked up at her sister. Lacy, sweetie, we can't stay. We just found out that you were here, so we waited. Adele is not herself. She's not physically hurt, but, well, you'll have to see for yourself. As for Earl, he's very weak. He actually looks different, more like he used to, but not quite. As she spoke, she walked alongside Lacy to the box end of the truck. Lacy hugged her daughter, then Oscar followed suit, and finally Earl, too. She stared in astonishment at Earl. He was still hairy for a two-leg, but his wonderful coat had fallen from him. His body and face looked more like he used to look. He still had wolfish aspects, but most had shed from him. He even smelled a little better, at least a little less like something she wanted to murder. He smiled weakly up at her. Hey, my sweet Lacy girl, I think I found a cure. It's probably going to kill me, but... He panted for a while. Val, if I lose consciousness, no IV, no blood, not even plasma, no doctors, no meat for a while. Maybe Miriam, if you think she can help. Warn her what will happen, though, if I drink or eat human. With that, he fell into a doze. He still breathed and still lived, but it was unclear whether he would ever awaken. Val touched his head, and he felt cold and clammy. She looked to Lacy. I know it seems weird, but the best way to get going is to use this truck. We can get back to your territory in short order. Lacy was smart and often stopped to think more than most of her ilk. However, she was not one to argue pointlessly when she saw a good plan. She and her pack hopped into the back of the truck, but before they could close the door, Val froze and stared into the woods. Lacy was sure that the two-legged hunters had finally arrived. She prepared to leap out and surprise them. Then she noted a familiar odor and heard Val say gently, Lady Godiva, I see that Sir Slamsalot has finally rescued his damsel. Do you want to come with us? We're going to a safe territory that's nearby. Don't worry, we'll be back and take care of the monsters in that lab. The two-legged monsters. The old folks of the forest glanced at one another and then back at Val. Without sound or gesture, they stepped up into the back of the truck. Val hurried up to the front and got the rig underway. No one would ever believe my cargo, she grinned. I just hope Earl can hang on for us. For me, she whispered the last two words to herself, not daring to hope. Dr. Z was in near panic. Pain and pressure had begun to build in his chest. The skunk ape showed signs of awakening from its trance-like state. The lab-grown version of the zombie venom. There was a rattle at the door as it opened. There stood the keeper, looking very much worse for wear. "Dr. Z, you don't look well. We best get you upstairs. The live monitor got herself smashed to pieces against all the equipment in the control room. At least the monitoring stuff." They arrived at the lab room where Blanchard had been. The straps were undone and the man was gone. The stupid Z-Techs. All Francois had to do was instruct them. Still, he should have been unconscious for at least another night and a day. "Mr. Forrest, I am too weak to proceed. Please go on to the control center and initiate the total lockdown mode." The keeper bobbed his head and shuffled out from the room to do his boss's bidding. Dr. Z, with trembling hands, fed a fresh IV needle into his arm. Fortunately, his veins protruded with age, or he would have had more difficulty. He set up the bag from the final lot, the third batch. His vision was blurred. He'd missed the first batch, the one he'd given Dr. Blanchard. The second batch was tucked away on the opposite side of the refrigerator shelf. He had reservations about the third batch. It contained more of the mutation catalyst, but he didn't have time to look. He slipped into the worst phase of his heart attack ever as the drip began, and as his vision grayed, he was sure he had run out of time. He faintly heard the empty, synthesized voice of the notification system warning of the impending total lockdown and sealing procedure. So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.